Hi, this is Dennis Dalton, Safety Officer, and tonight's safety meeting is about the impossible turn, engine failure soon after takeoff. Everybody, when they go flying, um, just by utilizing the skills they have, is always learning something new. And some people go up specifically to try and hone their skills. A couple people mentioned it to me that they go up regularly trying to work on engine failure soon after takeoff and see what it would take to turn around back to the runway. So I thought that might be an interesting thing to look at. And I used the movie Sully, the Miracle on the Hudson, kind of as a springboard and to kind of look at some of those things that were brought up in the movie, and then to talk about practicing that maneuver. The movie Sully highlights two factors associated with power failure. Let me get my little red, yeah, there we go. Soon after takeoff. One is reaction time, the other is practice. As I can't do live video on here, I'm actually found the screenplay and pulled these things right out of the screenplay. You have Sully talking at an NTSB meeting, and Skiles is first officer. So I'm just cutting in right here, and I will read these. I have a couple slides of this exchange. Sully, no one said you're about to lose both engines at a lower altitude than any jet in history, but be cool. Turn back for LaGuardia like you're going out to pick up the goddamn milk. His outrage pins the room to the wall. Sully, this was a dual engine loss at 2,800 feet, followed by an immediate water landing. 155 souls on board. No one has ever trained for an incident like that. No one. Skiles, first officer. Sully's right. It's absurd to expect immediate turn for the airport. I imagine if you were to lose an engine or when something happens when you're out flying, there is a reaction time to trying to assimilate what's happened. And so what we're talking about now in practice is how do you expect the unexpected? Screenplay continued. Sully and the Teterboro landing, which was a sim demonstration, which I put in there during that meeting, with an unrealistic bank angle, which that bank angle was, by the way, they had to put in 66 degrees in order to get where they were going to accomplish it in the sim. This wasn't the Blue Angels up there. I'd like to know how many times a pilot practiced the maneuver before he actually pulled it off. Long pause, no answer from the NTSB forthcoming. Sully, not questioning the pilots. They're good pilots, but they've clearly been instructed to head to the airports, LaGuardia and Teterboro, immediately after the bird strike. LaGuardia or Teterboro. NTSB review board had not considered the reaction time of the pilots. Sully again, you have allowed no time for analysis and decision making, and with these sims you've taken all the humanity out of the cockpit. How much time did these pilots spend making their plans for this event? Hours? Days? You're looking for human error, then make it human. The NTSB confers. Skiles, it wasn't a video game, it was life and death. Sully's right, that's worth a few seconds. Charles Porter contacts the NTSB employee, contacts Airbus via satellite and confers with them while the others await the decision. Sim pilots had a lot of practice. The room is heavy with anticipation. Sully, please ask them how many practice runs they had. Elizabeth Davis from the NTSB, 17. Sully retorts 17. Elizabeth Davis again. The pilot who landed the Teterboro had 17 practice attempts before the simulation we just witnessed. All Sully can do is shake his head. Charles Porter hangs up with Airbus. Charles Porter, the reaction time, decision time, will be set at 35 seconds. Skiles, that's not enough time. Sully, it's something. We only had 28 seconds total, so I'll take it. Both sim attempts crash with a 35-second reaction time figured into the scenario. The conclusion from that is practice does improve performance, but practice needs to be an accurate recreation of the task, which is what we'll talk about now. AOPA pilot contributor Barry Schiff's steps for the so-called impossible turn. We'll go over this real quick and then cover this in a little more detail. But one of the important things here is the key to Schiff's approach is to find out how much altitude you need to turn around safely, not to try to turn the aircraft around in a preset amount of altitude. Doing it the second way, you don't know what you can do. And like the 17 times they had to try and do that, if you have 500 feet, maybe you can turn it around in 15 or 17 tries. But realistically, how many times would you like to practice it to see how much altitude you do need? That's the idea here. And then his scenario in bullets is set up on a cardinal heading, climb halfway between Vx and Vy, pull the throttle to idle at a pre-established altitude, hold the same climb pitch for 5 seconds. Now this is the one in yellow, which means the reaction time that you may need to realize what happened rather than all of a sudden just trying to crank the airplane around because you think you can make it to the runway or make your practice thing. So that was one of the things Barry Schiff added in here. Roll into a 45-degree turn, pitch for best glide, turn 270 into the wind. We'll talk about all these on the next slide. Roll wings level, simulated flare to stop sink rate. Note altitude loss, add 50% of the altitude loss for a safe cushion is what that says behind my head. So let's just go over this here. There aren't a lot of slides here. This one's probably the heaviest. Begin the maneuver at, let's say, 3,000 feet, AGL. I mean, you could do it at 25, I guess. Slow to rotation speed, apply full power. Climb 500 feet between best angle and best rate of climb. Well, in the T-41, if we just use that right now, which is the main airplane most people are using, VX is 70 and VY is 95, so half of that's 12.5, so that's 82.5 miles an hour. Before pulling the throttle to idle, then with the airspeed bleeding off, maintain the same pitch-up attitude for 5 seconds. Why hold the attitude? Schiff says it will take 5 seconds to recognize and react to the real emergency, so this time relay will help achieve a more accurate recreation. I think also more accurate recreation up here as far as the speed goes is what speed do you always climb at? Are you really watching your speed, or is it varying between 85 and 95, or what is it? That's something, if you do in practice, you become a better pilot, more aware of it. Okay, then you're rolling into a 45-degree bank. Once you finally realize that you waited 5 seconds for the airspeed to bleed off. Well, left or right, depending on the wind. Knowing which way the wind's coming from before you depart is always a good idea. That's not always coming right down the runway. Now, yes, of course, if you're doing other maneuvers in the pattern, you will have to go to the left. If you were doing a power-off approach, for instance, or you're doing an accuracy landing for private or something, yeah, you got to turn left or right depending on what the controller says and so on. But, in a real emergency, you can go either way you want. So if you're up there practicing that, you may want to practice it, knowing where the wind is coming from. You'd have to do it, to the left or the right and see what the difference is based on the wind. because when you're practicing at altitude this maneuver, you can point it right into where you think the wind's coming from, or however, however you want to do that. Letting the nose naturally fall through the horizon to reach the best glide speed. In a T-41, the best glide speed is 85. Now, interestingly enough, of course, halfway between best rate and best angle is almost 85. It's like 83, 82 and a half. So, if you climb at that speed, then that's the glide speed. And then applying back pressure to maintain it, retrim the aircraft. You won't have power at this time, so you would need to retrim, because the speed at which you are gliding makes a lot of difference, even if you only have a few hundred feet. Continue the turn for 270 degrees, because reversing course to the runway requires more than a 180-degree turn. 180 degrees only places the airplane parallel to the runway and displaced to one side. Shift consoles 45 degrees of additional turn are needed to return to the runway. And let's say if you went to the left, then you got to turn 45 degrees more to the left to get on locate the runway, and then you got to turn 45 degrees to the right to get straight over the runway. So that's roughly 270 degrees you're turning. It's not 180 45 plus 45 plus 45. It is, but you might be going left and right. You're going to have to, or right and left on the last two. Practice is the key. With regular practice at altitude to memorize a maneuver, establish a constant pitch attitude, and look outside, you will have a better reference point to make a decision in the event you have an unexpected engine failure at takeoff. Now, this is the T-41 C&D POH engine failure immediately after takeoff, right out of the book. It doesn't offer a lot of help, and so that's why practicing this for yourself is very helpful. Mostly, and what you have over here is an emergency landing checklist, which you would not have time to make anyway at 300 to 500 feet. But we'll go over this real quick. If the engine should fail immediately after becoming airborne and altitude precludes the possibility of aborting on the runway or restarting the engine, land straight ahead, turning only as necessary to avoid obstructions. Looks like I have a little L in there I can get rid of. Apply the following procedures as time and conditions permit, which in an emergency landing from altitude you probably would have time to pull out the checklist and look at this. But in the pattern, if you're not at pattern altitude yet, you won't, more likely. Glide, establish, engine instruments check. If you suspect a partial power engine failure and oil pressure is available, the prop pitch may still be controllable. In such an event, moving the propeller control knob to full decrease will provide the optimum glide distance. I'm sure all of you are flying the D or the 182 are aware of that. When the engine does quit, as you know, the propeller will go to the flat pitch if the oil pressure is lost. That's the same thing as pushing the prop knob all the way in. What they're saying, if you suspect a partial power failure, you would have some oil pressure and you would pull it out. Now, spinning it out isn't the idea. You won't have time. Push the lock knob on the end in and just pull it all the way back. You could do that anyway, because if you don't have oil pressure, it's just going to stay to the full increase anyway, and you aren't going to be able to control it. The issue, though, is that if you do this, and knowing how to fly a constant speed prop, you cannot put the power back in, certainly full power, unless you put the prop back to full increase before you add the throttle, if you are practicing this maneuver. So, but it does make a difference if you, like for instance, if you're doing a power off 180 in a D and you want to try that and you have the prop full increase or pushed all the way in because that was part of your landing checklist because that's what you want in case you do a go around. Well, that airplane will drop faster. I can't say exactly how much. But since it's idling and you have full oil pressure, if you were to put it in full decrease, you would notice that airplane almost lunge ahead. It has a lot less resistance in the wind with the prop, and you can glide farther. So that's just something for you to experiment with and think about. Just make sure that if you put it in full decrease, that you put it in full increase before you push the throttle back in. And then the rest of these are the regular boilerplate for landing with a engine failure off airport. Warning, don't attempt to turn back to the runway or spend excessive time trying to accomplish the checklist. A stall or loss of aircraft control may result if time permits. Each crew member should ensure seatbelts are tightened, shoulder harnesses are secure, cabin doors should be unlocked open in the event of landing in a rough terrain. Those are all off-airport emergency landing procedures. In the past, we've talked about those as memory items because some of this can get fast and furious. As Sully said, he had 208 seconds, which is amazing. Yeah, and even in a small plane, maybe that's more than 3 minutes, and you don't have a whole lot more than that. Anyway, 3-4 minutes. You know, the 182, this is all they offer you out of the POH, which isn't much. You have all the same issues as you do with the T41s C and D. Unfortunately, you also have the gear. And whether this, what this can tell you is what would you do? Well, if you practice maneuver with the gear down at altitude, it would seem to me, and then you found out what your turnaround rate was and your altitude was that you could do that at, and then maybe that's the altitude you would use before you put the gear up. I mean, if you're putting that gear up really soon and something happens and you got to land it right away, you got 7 or 8 seconds to put the gear either back down, or if it's on its way up, do you arrest that procedure and go the other way? And, there's, all of those considerations should be practiced, and that is probably one of the things that would dictate practice in giving you your own parameters for how you would deal with putting gear up on takeoff. Because gear up on takeoff, 20 feet off the ground and the engine quits, you can put it back down if you want to, but it probably won't get down and locked before you hit the ground, probably. And there's drag there, and so on and so forth. So that just really further complicates things, and this is not a lot of help. And this is for basically an emergency landing. I looked at emergency landing as far as failure. They're both about the same thing. They just add a few more things about opening the doors and stuff. So it's not real helpful. You need to practice that if you want a successful outcome. So in summary, practice an engine failure on departure scenario. That's a good idea, as some people had mentioned to me last month that they do all the time. I think that's great. I don't do it enough. How much altitude do you need to turn around safely? Well, that should be the answer, not a magic number that you're trying to make. If you get better at it, you'll probably be able to do it in less and less altitude. But if you don't like practicing that all the time, then maybe the first 2 or 3 times you do it, you know how much altitude you need, and that's pretty good. Then if you got less, you won't try it. Make that altitude call out part of your pre-departure checklist. We used to say, above 500 feet straight ahead, 750. I think it was below 500 feet land straight ahead. Above 500 to 750 could be a 45 or 90-degree turn, and so on and so forth. But those are all standard generic things that, we used to use those as call outs, but that you really need to go over that because everybody's going to have they're going to say, boy, that thing quit at 500 feet. I'm going to try and make the airport, It's like, not a good idea. Not if you can't turn that thing around in less than 700 feet. You aren't going to make it. Well, that's better knowing that maybe you got a 90-degree turn to avoid obstacles, but you aren't going to make the airport. Trying to make the airport when you know you can't make the airport is just going to stall. Conclusion, engine failure possibility is always present. Emergency landing with no power in all scenarios should be practiced. With practice, the turn back to the airport is possible if you know your altitude limits. Okay, so much for that. That's the end of this safety briefing. This is Dennis Dalton for the Rocky Mountain Flight Training Center.